Modernism is more than just a style or a movement. It's a state of mind. It's a willingness to push boundaries, challenge assumptions, and question the status quo. On this podcast, we'll be exploring the techniques and innovations that have enabled artists, writers, and thinkers to create new and innovative works that defy categorization. From collage to fragmentation, and from a stream of consciousness to polyphonic narration, we'll examine the ways in which modernism has inspired and transformed our understanding of art, culture, and society.
Hello everyone! It's Marzi Gordashkhani.
This is Mobina Soleimani, and welcome to our podcast.
Modernism as a literary movement emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a response to the traditional forms and conventions of the previous era. The movement was characterized by a rejection of the traditional narrative structures, realist descriptions, and clear moral boundaries that had dominated literary works for centuries, towards a more experimental and fragmented approach, and by a rejection of traditional forms and conventions in various artistic fields, including literature, art, music, and architecture.
In the traditional literary canon, stories often followed a linear narrative structure with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and featured well-defined characters, plots, and themes. Realist description were also a hallmark of traditional literature, with authors aiming to accurately depict the world and around them in vivid detail. Moral boundaries were also clear-cut, with good and evil characters neatly divided.
Modernist writers, however, sought to challenge these conventions and push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in literature. They experimented with nonlinear narrative structures, fragmenting their stories into multiple perspectives, non-chronological events, and disjointed chronologies. This approach allowed for greater freedom and flexibility in storytelling, as well as a more nuanced exploration of themes and characters.
Some key features of modernist literature include nonlinearity. Modernist writers often abandoned traditional narrative structures, instead using nonlinear techniques like flashbacks, flash-forwards, and fragmented narratives to create a sense of dislocation and uncertainty. Experimentation with form. Modernists experimented with unconventional forms such as collage, stream of consciousness narration, and free verse poetry. Subjectivity. Modernist writers often explored the subjective experience of characters, blurring the lines between reality and fantasy. Disruption of traditional narrative. Modernists often disrupted traditional narrative structures by using unconventional openings, multiple endings, or unexpected plot twists. Fragmentation. Modernist writers often fragmented their stories into multiple narratives, exploring different perspectives and experiences. Emphasis on interiority. Modernists emphasize the inner lives and thoughts of characters, often using a stream of consciousness narration to convey their inner experiences. Challenging moral boundaries. Modernist writers often challenge traditional moral boundaries by exploring complex moral dilemmas and ambiguous characters. Examples of modernist writers include James Joyce, Ulysses, Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. These writers' works not only reflected the cultural and intellectual upheavals of their time, but also influenced subsequent literary movements, such as postmodernism and contemporary experimental fiction.
One of the key techniques used by modernist writers to achieve this was a stream of consciousness. This involved writing in a fluid, unstructured manner, often without punctuation or clear sentence boundaries, to replicate the natural flow of thoughts and feelings in the human mind. This technique allowed writers to explore the inner workings of the human psyche, creating a sense of intimacy and immediacy with the reader. For example, in James Joyce's novel Ulysses, it is a classic example of a stream of consciousness writing. The book follows the inner thoughts and feelings of the protagonist, Leopold Bloom, as he goes about his daily routine.
Another important technique used by modernist writers was the interior monologue. This involved presenting the thoughts and feelings of a character through a direct address to the reader, often without explicit narrative structure. This technique allowed writers to explore the inner lives of their characters, creating a sense of depth and complexity. For example, Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, features an interior monologue, as the protagonist, Clarissa Dalloway, reflects on her life and thoughts as she prepares for a party.
The use of frame narratives was another common technique in modernist literature. This involved placing a main story within a larger narrative framework, often with multiple layers or nested stories. This technique allowed writers to explore complex themes and ideas, creating a sense of depth and complexity. For example, in George Louis Borges' short story, The Library of Babel, it is a frame narrative that tells the story of a narrator who becomes trapped in an infinite loop within the Library of Babel.
Multiple narration. This involved presenting multiple narratives or perspectives within a single work, often without clear transitions or connections between them. This technique allowed writers to explore different aspects of a story or theme, creating a sense of complexity and nuance. For example, William Faulkner's novel, As I Lay Dying, features multiple narrators, each with their own unique perspective and voice, as they tell the story of the Bondurant family's journey to bury their mother's body.
Parallel narration. This involved presenting multiple narratives or perspectives that run parallel to each other, often with no clear connection or overlap between them. This technique allowed writers to explore different themes or ideas simultaneously, creating a sense of complexity and depth. For example, in James Joyce's novel Finnegan's Wake, it features parallel narration as it explores different themes and ideas through multiple narratives that run concurrently.
The combination of foreshadowing and flashback. This involved using techniques such as foreshadowing,
Hinting at events that will occur later,
and flashback
presenting events that have already occurred.
to create a sense of tension and suspense. This technique allowed writers to explore complex themes and ideas, creating a sense of depth and complexity. For example, F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, features foreshadowing and flashback as it explores the tragic events surrounding the wealthy community in 1920s America.
George Luis Borges was an Argentine writer who is widely regarded as one of the most important modernist writers. His work is characterized by its use of complex literary techniques, such as labyrinthine narratives and multiple meanings. Borges' writing often explores themes of identity, reality, and perception, creating a sense of complexity and depth.
In his short story, The Library of Babel, Borges uses a combination of frame narrative and multiple narration to create a sense of complexity and depth. The story begins with a description of the Library of Babel, which is said to contain every possible book that could be written. The narrator then describes his own search for meaning within the library, only to discover that he is trapped in an infinite loop.
In The Garden of Working Path, Borges uses parallel narration. This story follows two characters who are trying to find each other in a labyrinthine garden. The narrator's account is interspersed with sections from other perspectives, creating a sense of multiple narratives running parallel to each other.
Borges' use of these techniques allows him to explore complex themes and ideas that is characteristics of modernist literature.
In conclusion, modernist writers employed a diverse range of innovative techniques to craft complex and thought-provoking works that deviated from traditional literary forms and conventions. These experimental techniques, which included a stream of consciousness, interior monologue, framework, multiple narration, parallel narration, and the combination of foreshadowing and flashback, enabled writers to push the boundaries of storytelling and explore themes that were previously uncharted or underexplored.
One of the most significant ways in which modernist writers used these techniques was to create a sense of immediacy and intimacy with their readers. By employing a stream of consciousness and interior monologue, writers like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and Marcel Proust were able to directly access the thoughts and emotions of their characters, allowing readers to experience the world through their eyes. This technique also enabled writers to explore the inner working of their characters' mind, revealing their deepest fears, desires, and insecurities.
The use of framework and multiple narration allowed writers to experiment with nonlinear storytelling and challenge traditional notions of narrative structure. By fragmenting narratives into multiple strands or layers, writers like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and William Faulkner were able to create a sense of dislocation and disorientation, reflecting the chaos and uncertainty of modern life. This technique also enabled writers to explore themes such as identity, memory, and perception, as characters' experiences and perceptions were fragmented and reassembled across different narrative threads.
The use of parallel narration allowed writers to explore different perspectives and experiences simultaneously, creating a sense of multiplicity and complexity that was characteristic of modernist literature. By juxtaposing different narrative, voices, and perspectives, writers like William Faulkner, Toni Morrison, and Don DeLillo were able to create a sense of depth and richness that was previously absent in literature.
Finally, the combination of foreshadowing and flashback enabled writers to explore themes such as memory, history, and the human condition. By using these techniques to manipulate time and narrative structure, writers like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez were able to create a sense of timelessness and universality that transcended the boundaries of individual narratives.
Thank you for listening,
And have a good time!